Welcome to the Interaction Design Foundation video interview series. I'm very pleased to introduce William Hudson, who's here with us today. William Hudson is a veteran user experience designer and a very talented and very experienced designer. So we're very happy to have him with us today. So welcome, William.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, thanks. And thanks again for coming in and speaking with us today. So the first question we'd like to ask you is, how did you get into user experience design and user-centered design in the first place?
Well, it's a slightly long story because I've been in IT, or I've been developing software for about more than 40 years. About 1971 or 72 I started. But I was working with graphical user environments in the 1980s, and it became increasingly obvious to me through painful experience that we really didn't have much of a good idea of how to build usable systems, especially GUIs. This was the stage where we were moving away from what was by then the traditional IBM PC approach, which was still very much character-based, towards screen images, and the WIMP approach, Windows icons, mice, and pointers. And so I got interested in HCI, and I started to do a course in HCI at the time, and I started attending lots of lectures and doing lots of reading. And it was an area that absolutely fascinated me because I used to really love understanding how things worked, how computers worked. I would take to my bedroom when I was a teenager, assembly manuals for IBM 360s and just pore over them. And here we have in HCI a manual of how people work, this other really important component of our systems when we're talking about interactive systems in particular. So this was fantastic, some insights into how these important technical components of our systems work. So that was back in the early 90s. And I've been developing software and working in HCI. And really my focus for the last 20 odd years has been what I'd describe, and it's still a popular term in some circles, as user-centered design. So usability has kind of morphed into user experience, but really it's pretty much just a change of label. But user-centered design has remained pretty much a constant, actually trying to involve real users throughout the project lifecycle, to me is really key to producing successful interactive systems.
And which skills do you feel are required for a career as a user experience designer or in user-centered design?
Well, that's a hard question. And I'm going to have to give you a rather long answer to it. I think there are a whole plethora of skills that juggling various priorities. So juggling, conceptually at least, is quite an important one. So both acting as a facilitator and as a go-between between the development team and the users. Acting as a resource, making sure that people understand why certain things are being done the way that they are. Acting as a salesperson, trying to sell user-centered design and user experience to possibly your team or possibly to the organization. Trying to produce good experiences with users when you're using them for research, so they actually don't feel too stressed by the whole situation. And of course trying to get the best from users in the sense of, is this what they would really be doing away from the lab, or is this an entirely artificial situation? Plus, as I said, it was a plethora of skills. You really do need to have a bit of an understanding about the technical aspects. It can be really fantastically cumbersome to be having conversations with the rest of the team, the technical part of the team, with no real understanding of what some of these technical issues are. And so having some kind of technical background does help. That doesn't by any sense mean that you need to be a programmer. I have spoken to people in user experience design who say that all UX roles should take programming courses, but I'm fully aware of the fact that programming is a pretty specialist skill, and just being aware of what's required is probably adequate in most cases, although increasingly companies are looking for UX designers who also are able to do some development, perhaps in HTML and JavaScript.
Now, how would you distinguish between the roles of, let's say, on one hand, a user experience designer, and on the other hand, a usability engineer?
Well, they can be different roles. I certainly have seen organizations where user experience is not really being done in the same way as usability. I think much to the detriment of users, that user experience is just thinking and talking about users, whereas usability and user-centered design is actually getting out there and working with users. So I think that perhaps is an important distinction that I um, am aware of in my work, that I've gone to companies who um, describe people as being UX designers, and the UX designers are not doing user research, they're not doing usability evaluations, they're just talking about user journeys a lot and imagining what the user journey should be. Now, admittedly, it is better for someone with an understanding of user experience to be describing and working with user journeys. But really, ideally, we should be trying to interact a lot more directly with users, and for me, that is what usability specialists and user-centered designers do.
Okay, and now for a perhaps a vague question, but a very important question. Why is usability testing important?
Well, it is the most important tool in our toolbox. The thing that I am careful to point out is that it's not the only tool in our toolbox. The main reason for it being so important is that, again, it's direct involvement of users in as realistic a scenario as we can muster in a meeting room or a usability lab. And of course, for that reason, usability testing can be somewhat artificial. And there are severe limitations to usability testing. You're never going to be testing everything, it's just too expensive. You're certainly not going to be testing the things you didn't implement most of the time. Some people do testing of paper prototypes, and that's a very good thing to be doing early on in a project.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, usability testing, is seen by the engineering community, certainly the software engineering community, as just another validation phase at the end of a project. And for that, usability testing, I think, it can be a serious problem. We don't want to be talking about usability testing just as a new hurdle. So as I say, I think it's the most important tool in the box. It isn't the only tool in the box, and we need to be a little bit circumspect about how we apply it. But having said that, it is involving users directly, and that's always a good thing.
And how do you go about getting the most out of your usability testing sessions? Are there any particular things you do in the planning or execution to make sure that you get as much out of the session as possible?
Well, what I'm always careful to do is to try to set realistic tasks. So these are things which are not just bits and pieces of the system that we're building. They are a real live scenario that may well be, or hopefully is, of direct interest to the user in front of you. So, for example, if we're talking about a website that's selling holiday insurance, then we would deliberately recruit users who are interested or have recently purchased holiday insurance, and we would give them a scenario which hopefully doesn't sound too fantastically different to one that they could imagine in their own heads. And then actually don't do very much during the usability session. We ask them to do this thing. We do encourage users to think aloud, but I'm not terribly pedantic about that. I don't believe it's necessarily a good thing for users to be speaking out loud, or thinking out loud, I should say, the whole time, because we do know that that can be very mentally taxing. So if it's a complicated scenario that we've given them, then expecting them to be speaking continuously is perhaps an unrealistic situation. So we try to make sure it's a realistic scenario. We let them get on with it. We want to make sure they do it as much as possible, the way that they would do it at home or in the office. And of course, that's never going to happen, really, because we've paid the money to turn up to this either lab or meeting room or whatever it is, and they're not going to just give up and go away when something frustrates them. We do tell them, do let me know. I always make sure that they're aware that I want to know when they might reasonably have stopped of their own free will, just so that we can gauge how frustrating they're finding the experience. but basically letting them proceed as much as possible under their own steam, encouraging them to do whatever it was that they would do in their own homes or businesses, and just trying to make them feel comfortable with the whole situation.
So an important part of the designer's role is to make people feel comfortable during the session and open enough to share their experiences and their thoughts without a filter.
Yes, I mean some people really actively need that. Other people, and I'm afraid they're not usually terribly useful as participants. Other people will not stop letting you know what they think about absolutely everything. I get at least one of those every time I run usability testing. Typically, I'm running sessions for 2 or 3 days, and we run about 5 or 6 participants a day. That's pretty much par for the course. And one of those participants will per day will not be useful for a number of reasons, but a very common reason is that they're really taking you far too literally and about thinking out loud, and they're just giving you basically a brain dump the whole time of things which are really not helpful or important to you. And all you can do is smile and make notes and make them think that they're being useful to you, because I don't want to send people away feeling bad about themselves. That's really that's not a very useful thing to be doing. It's possibly has ethical ramifications as well. So we just grind through it, because it usually is a grind, and at the end we say, well, that's unfortunate because we can't use that participant. But making people feel comfortable, and where they are being a little bit taciturn or shy, just trying to encourage them to do whatever they think they would do normally, and think aloud when, particularly when things are confusing for them. If I can see that they're looking for something, I'll ask them what it is if they haven't already said, or if they've made a mistake, I'll let them finish, and then I'll go back and say, when you got to this point, what do you think might have caused you to go for that option? And of course, verbalizing after the event is always a little bit risky, but it does give you some ideas about what's happening in the head, what the design has done to cause this particular problem to occur.
Yeah. And which usability techniques do you usually use now?
Well, usability testing is still what I spend a fair bit of time doing, but I'm pretty well known for my work in card sorting. I did a lot of work back in the early 2000s on card sorting, which has been pretty much taken up by most of the card sorting websites. People like Optimal Workshop and a couple of others. They've all adopted some of my charts and techniques. I wrote some articles for the ACM Interactions magazine all those years ago. It must be about, well, around about 2002, 2003. So I'm still quite fond of card sorting. The problem I have personally with card sorting, especially when I'm either teaching it or doing it on behalf of customers, that people have pretty unrealistic, I'll start again, people have pretty much unrealistic expectations of it. They are assuming that the cluster analysis is just going to drop a finished navigational hierarchy in their laps, and that's really not what card sorting is about, or what it's good for. It's good for actually finding out how people think about a problem domain and clustering things together that they feel belong together, but you still need to make the choices about how you're going to present this to users. And consequently, another technique that's very much related, called tree sorting, which is kind of an inverse card sorting, I find a very, very powerful technique, because you can take a number of candidate terms for a navigation design, maybe hundreds of them, and you feed them into a tree sort using the navigation hierarchy you have in mind, and the tree sort will simulate your menu hierarchy to users. And so you set the users tasks to do, and you can decide how many tasks randomly selected from this long list each participant's going to have to do. And at the end of the day, you get some really wonderful analyses out showing you, well, when you asked people to find oranges, they looked under soft fruit, which is not too surprising, because oranges aren't all that hard, but you've called them hard fruit, because that is don't know if you're aware of this, Adam, but hard fruit is a technical term in the grocery business, which means almost anything that isn't a berry. So if you let the problem domain expert decide your hierarchy, you will have a heading called hard fruit, and they won't be looking there for oranges. So that's the kind of thing you find out, that people were confused by this, and it lets you adjust your hierarchy accordingly. It was about expert designs. That's the other thing that I do spend a fair amount of time getting involved with, because typically we recommend that customers do an expert review before the usability testing, so we can familiarize ourselves with their solution, whatever it is, website or desktop application or mobile app or what have you. We can also point out what would be to us glaring potential issues, and they often are keen to fix those before we start spending fairly large amounts of money on a usability evaluation. And then, of course, you can also use that information to help you to decide what best to test, what most needs testing, which do you think are the riskiest parts of this interface. And that comes back to that original suggestion I made, that usability testing isn't the only tool in the box. There are things where an expert evaluation might well be perfectly adequate for something which is considered to be moderately low risk. You've done this 10 times before in very similar ways, and therefore you do not need to spend time and money testing this with real users, or everybody does it like this. This particular, entering credit card information is now, pretty standard. You don't actually need to go and design a new way of doing it. So expert evaluations become an important part of every usability evaluation for me. Other things, really not so much. I'm trying to think of, I never do diary studies. I personally rarely look at server logs, and I'm aware that is a very good area to be looking if you're using web-based technology and you want to find out how well your site is performing. Then obviously looking at server logs, but that really is more on the quantitative side, and my focus really is very much qualitative.
Okay, so let's focus on one particular usability testing technique, um, cognitive walkthrough. What does that particular technique entail?
Well, I teach cognitive walkthroughs. I actually don't use them all that often, but I think they are important and they can be extremely useful. And what it involves is actually walking your team. Maybe it would be a kind of like a code review session. You'd have a group of you together and you'd be looking at this user interface. And I've got some slides that I can bring up to show you this, so I'll just locate those. This is how I teach cognitive walkthroughs. And I don't even call it a cognitive walkthrough because I think the term sounds a bit scary, but this is really what it is. And it's based on Don Norman's interaction model. This is a little adaptation of it that I use. And you can see that we've got two sides of this model describing how people interact with all kinds of system, primarily technology. So on the Gulf of Execution side, we have users trying to do something. They've got a goal. What is it they want to achieve? They have to convert this into actions in your user interface. So of course, there's an awful lot of activity going on in their minds over what's possible, how would I do this, what do these words mean, what do these graphics mean, that kind of stuff. They managed to find something that maps onto what we call in HCI the system task. This is the thing the computer is actually doing, whether that computer is a good old-fashioned desktop PC or an iPhone is irrelevant. There is typically some kind of feedback that goes back through the user interface to be perceived by users, and hopefully they can. That's where that's where a large part of accessibility comes in. If you're relying on visual or audible cues that simply aren't perceived by that group of users, you're in a bit of trouble. And then finally, of course, the users evaluate what's just happened and decide how to proceed next. And this maps really nicely onto what I refer to as the 4 goal mapping questions. And there are quite a few different examples of these around. I think often there are only 3, but I like having the 4. the first question is how do users know that their goal is possible? The second question is how do users know what to do? The third is how will users know they've done the right thing? And the fourth is how will users know they've attained their goal? And if you think about it, it actually maps pretty much onto those steps in the interaction model. So the first question is you're looking at a user interface, you're looking at, say, a web page, and you want to maybe buy a cell phone. And it really does depend on whose web page you go to. Some cell phone manufacturers sell phones directly from their sites. Others do not. And, so you get to maybe the LG site. Now, I don't know offhand whether LG does sell phones directly. It used to be an issue with Sony Ericsson, when it was Sony Ericsson, that their site was only a catalog. And so you'd be looking for evidence that you could buy a phone there, and there was perhaps none at all. So that you'd stumble at the first hurdle. But these are the four questions, and they typically, as I show in this diagram, they typically cycle around steps or questions 2 and 3, and then finally, when you've decided you've actually finished, you move on to step 4. So the answers to these questions are also 4 in number. And they go from the least good reply, which is an implicit expectation. Well, it's a cell phone site. I would expect I should be able to buy a mobile phone here. So that is an implicit expectation, and that may or may not be correct. An explicit expectation is somebody's told you to go to a site and do something, or you've seen it mentioned somewhere else, like maybe on the homepage you saw 30% off men's shoes. But when you get into men's shoes, you can see no signs of this. So you've got this expectation, but you can't see any evidence of it in front of you on the page you're now visiting. An indirect match is where there is actually evidence on the page in front of you. And of course, these pages could, by the way, be pages in a mobile phone app, or pages in a website, or screen in a desktop application. It's really not that important what kind of technology we're talking about. But an indirect match is where an image or a term is kind of related to the thing that you're looking for. And the example I give here in the slide is that maybe we would be using, in a situation very much like this one, a collaborative drawing package, and I want to draw a circle on the screen for you. And I look around and I can't find anything that says draw a circle, or I can't even find a picture of a circle. But I do see an item that says draw ellipse. And falling back to my high school algebra, I realized that a circle is a special case of an ellipse, and so that's an indirect match. But there's quite a lot of cognitive processing going on there. So that, again, is not a particularly good solution. The best solution that we can hope for, and the one that we want to get most of the time, is something called a direct match, where we're thinking, well, I want to draw a circle, and there on the screen is either a picture of a circle or a draw menu, and I drop it down and it says circle. But oddly enough, it's the ellipse is the most common way of handling this in drawing packages, because they rely on people's knowledge of algebra. If you were doing this for 6 or 7-year-olds, you certainly couldn't rely on them knowing that a circle was a special case of an ellipse. But they may not be so bothered. It looks kind of round, so maybe that will do me, is perhaps what a 6 or 7-year-old would decide. So we'd have to do some usability testing on that. But that means that you've got this little table for every single goal that a user could reasonably have, certainly the important ones. And it has the 4 questions and the 4 answers. And what we're looking for are ticks in the boxes, or checks in the boxes down this right-hand side. So is the goal attainable? Yes. On this mobile phone website, I can see a shopping cart and I can see a shop now button. So that's fantastic news. In the example I was mentioning of the old Sony Ericsson site, you could actually dig around that site till the cows came home, but you would never actually find any evidence that you could buy a mobile phone, because it turned out at that time anyway you could not. How will they know what to do? Is there evidence right there on the page? And in the example of the mobile phone again, shop now, buy one, that kind of stuff, that would all be fantastically good from a direct match point of view. Have I done the right thing? Am I getting warmer? Am I getting closer to my goal? That ties in with the scent of information, as we're often keen to call it. So we're looking for evidence that, well, hey, I've ended up in a shop, or something here is very obvious. That I can see prices and I can see different models, and this is all absolutely excellent direct matching. And then finally, the checkout hopefully is really clear, and you're not left wondering whether you've actually got to the end. I've actually failed probably in my life about 10 or 12 times to buy something based on the fact that the thing I'm looking at says order confirmation at the top, and there is nothing else on the screen aside from the details of my order. It turns out that 2 or 3 pages down the screen is a final confirmation button that I would have no hope of seeing, and therefore the goal was not attained. And I didn't discover this until a couple of days later, when I think, hey, whatever happened to that mobile phone I ordered? So it does happen. People like Amazon are very aware of these kinds of issues, and they make sure that really important buttons are different colors. They make sure that they're visible on the screen. They make sure that people don't have to be clairvoyant, and they use appropriate language. So if they don't say it's confirmed, they don't use the confirmation word until you've actually confirmed it. So there's a lot that can inform design from this particular process. The downside is that if you're working with a team or within an organization that has low UX maturity, then you can walk through one of these with unrealistic optimism. Is the goal attainable? Well, yeah, this thing over here, this word that means something to us, perhaps not very direct. I don't have a good canned example of that to hand, but it wouldn't mean anything to real users, as it were. So we need to be realistic about this in terms of perhaps certainly with teams with low UX maturity involving real users and actually walking a real user through this process. How do you know this thing's possible? And get them to point at the screen shots or the pencil sketches. We can do all this with paper prototypes too. So it's just an excellent way of raising questions and making sure that we're doing the right things from a usability perspective.
Another very popular usability testing technique is heuristic evaluation. Do you have any experience or any thoughts about this particular technique?
Well, you'll often see expert evaluation or expert review / heuristic evaluation used together. And I think the reason is that heuristic evaluation is pretty much just using rules of thumb. Sometimes they get more explicit than that. But if, for example, you look at Jacob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics from over 20 years ago now, I can't remember exactly, I think he published them in the early 1990s, they are extremely high level, and you really could not use them very effectively as an evaluation tool without having a great deal of knowledge of HCI in general. Now, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's perhaps why we end up calling it most of the time an expert review or an expert evaluation. But I've actually worked a lot with a similar approach to heuristic evaluation, but I've made sure that the heuristics were at an adequately detailed level for the problem space in question. So I've got an example. Okay, yeah. I'll give you a little bit of background to this. I spent 7 years benchmarking intranets for a company that used to be called, not surprisingly, the Intranet Benchmarking Forum. And to do this, I would go into an organization and I would spend several hours looking at their intranet with a view to actually giving them a score on it. And for that, we needed something more than just fairly generic heuristics. So we developed a series of about 50 or 60 measures grouped into a number of higher level categories like visual design and navigation and content and so forth. And when I finished working with the IBF back in 2009, I decided to apply this same approach to e-commerce sites. And I'm probably not the first or the last person to have done this, but having had 7 years experience of doing it with intranet, I thought I was pretty well qualified. So what I'm showing here is a page from my site that you can reach by typing in the URL uxbench, one word, .com, and there are a couple of free reports here that I did back in 2009, 2010, and I'll just have a quick dive into this first report, the UK mobile phone e-commerce report, which is there on the page, and it loads up a PDF, and it's got a pretty picture of people looking diverse and friendly. Very important these days that you have a diverse and friendly picture on your title page. Now, what this is actually all about is about 70 metrics altogether, which are, of course, just detailed heuristics, and they're broken up into 13 categories altogether. So I'll just quickly whiz through these, some of these. So we've got content, visual design, navigation, I mentioned, engagement, and in e-commerce, that would be to the extent to which there are discussion facilities and rating facilities and that kind of thing. Accessibility, which is all about accessibility for disabled people, so people with visual impairments and so forth. Trust, persuasion. Persuasion's all about trying to sell up or sell across, that kind of thing, which Amazon's very good at. How effectively the shopping basket is designed and how effectively the search is designed. So that's on the design side. On the usability side, I look at the actual processes of going through selecting a product, the process of going through the checkout, how you might manage your account once you've created one of those, and whether there's very much in the way of online support and how effective that is. And that means that we can actually take these metrics, altogether I think 67 of them, and apply scores, having looked at some of the sites, and come up with things like this league table of overall user experience. Bearing in mind this is 2009, so these sites have probably changed fairly dramatically since then. But in this particular league table, which is overall user experience, we have a small and not terribly well-known company in the UK called Expanses. I think they're in France as well. And they were the best, but of the sort of mainstream players, O2 comes in with a score of only 50%, because it turned out a lot of these people actually were doing nothing in terms of follow-on support or account management or many of the things I've just mentioned. All of their effort was, not surprisingly, in just selling the things, and not even providing at that stage a means for users to review or discuss particular models. So O2 is best with 50%, and actually goes down to the bottom, which is Tesco's, which had serious problems at the time with its sites. They were rather split across different technologies, depending on whether you were on contract or buying phones outright, that kind of thing. So they had a score of 36. And looking then in more detail, going on to say the first, well, here's a table of average scores by metric group. And you can see that the highest scoring metric group is visual design. And of course, people do spend a lot of time and money making sure that their websites are attractive. But the worst was actually persuasion. So although I mentioned that Amazon was very good at providing you with alternatives when you before you check out, while you check out, after you check out, when you first get to the home page, you get things that you might like to consider buying. Almost everyone else is actually pretty rubbish at it. So persuasion is one of the lowest scoring figures there, with only 11%. And online support, absolutely appalling. Very few organizations did anything other than tell you, ring them if you've got any problems. But let's look at just one particular design group, let's say content, because it's the first one. So here we are. O2 has the highest scoring content, and content is made up of metrics or heuristics called structure, detail, meaning, price, whether the price is actually displayed effectively and meaningfully, whether people will understand that that's the price. Believe it or not, there are websites where the price is actually a little bit obscured because they've reduced it in one place on the page but not in the other, that kind of thing. Availability, delivery, consistency. So those are 7 metrics or heuristics that we apply for that content score. And I think that's a good use of heuristics, because it means you don't have to be an absolute expert in human-computer interaction in general to be able to understand and even apply some of these things, although obviously you do need some prior experience of e-commerce sites. But for me, that's a really useful application of that general heuristics approach.
Do you have any tips or any particular methods that you use when you're developing a set of heuristics?
Well, they're all pretty much goal oriented in the sense that, what do we achieve by focusing on structure? I mean, what is it about the structure of content that is either good or bad for users? And of course, we're trying to get users to stay on our site and to buy our goods. So we look at the structure of the text, and it turns out, because we've known this for some time in web design, that you need to have a good visual structure as well as good content structure. We're talking about content structure here, but it means breaking text up into chunks, using bulleted lists, making sure that important things appear first, making sure that you're using what's called the inverted pyramid technique, where the most important stuff is at the top of the text, and as you move further through the text, you're getting into more and more detail that perhaps somebody who is not so interested could just skip over or stop reading. So the idea being with that kind of approach that we're actually focusing on what we think is important for users in achieving their goal. So I would say goal oriented, but you do need to have lots of access to what counts as good and bad in terms of examples. When I was doing this for IBF, we used to do regular reports on what got low scores, and regrettably, we always had to make sure that we completely obscured the low scoring site details, intranet details. So we would actually try to mask these things so it was anonymous. But it's rather hard to do, especially when some sites are using very blaring colors, but showing people this is what a low score looks like, this is what a high score looks like. Another example, which is common to most websites, is navigational feedback. We know that navigational feedback is important, and we do know that probably breadcrumb navigation is still one of the most effective ways of giving good navigational feedback, but it's not the only way. And so we're not actually reprimanding people who haven't given us breadcrumb navigation, but we are looking to make sure that what they have done is as effective as breadcrumb navigation, the navigation line you get at the top of pages, because in many real world situations, people don't come into a site through the home page. They end up on a random page that happened to have the words that matched in the search, and they want to be able to navigate to related pages. And a breadcrumb navigation line, when people are aware of it and it works well, is absolutely fantastic for that.
So should the heuristics be targeted at the aims of the users, their tasks, or the end goals?
Well, can I say yes? Yes, it's the coming back to the content example. We want people to not get fed up and leave the site, and the way that you do that is providing them with the information that they want in as efficient a manner as possible, given that we know that people are prone to skimming on the internet. And so structure, for example, is important. Detail is important if you're talking about an optimizing user, somebody who's keen on finding the best of a particular series of Android handsets, for example, wants adequate detail. We know that delivery information is important. It's actually a legal requirement in the UK, although nobody seems to be aware of this. Part of the 2002 Electronic Commerce Act says that every website should tell you whether the prices include VAT and whether they include delivery and how much delivery is and that kind of stuff. So it's not targeting. I realized I was talking about goals, but it's not really so much the user goals as is the goals of the page or the goals of the design. What are we trying to do here with this design, with this particular page? We're trying to sell this thing on an e-commerce site, and we're trying to sell it in as efficient and effective a means as possible, given our understanding of our users.
And how about downsides? Are there any downsides to using heuristics?
Well, yeah, quite a few, unfortunately. I mean, one of the most obvious is that with any set of guidelines, they're always in conflict with each other. So you might have a heuristic that says that structure is important, that you ought to use lists, and you might have a heuristic that says all the important information should be on the top screen of a long page. and the two just don't work out. You start putting too much stuff in lists, you end up with pages which require pages that require two or three screens to scroll over, and you've now broken one guideline in the pursuit of another. So there's always a tension there, and it does require actual understanding of where these heuristics come from, and possibly even live usability testing. And when I say live, I mean with real users, to establish what really you should have done in the first instance, in spite of the heuristics you were trying to follow.
And during the actual usability testing sessions, what kinds of documentation do you use to capture the user's feedback and to be able to remember it and execute on it at a later stage in the design process?
Well, I don't know if how many people do this, but I've been doing usability testing and user research generally for quite a long time, and I've always taken notes at the time onto a very small and unobtrusive laptop. So, I am glancing away from the user and I am doing some typing, and I try to make that as low key as possible so that I'm not, hiding behind a 17-inch laptop screen, that kind of thing. But I am aware that that isn't necessarily the most comfortable situation for everyone. It's not necessarily the most effective. But what it does for me is, because I'm going through and writing down what I think is important at the time, then it actually provides me with quite a good basis for the subsequent reports. Some people might have a second facilitator in the session, and they would be taking notes, but for me, they're my notes, and I need to have made them myself. So that's what I find works. Other people, and this is perfectly possible, but for me, I think it's got some noticeable drawbacks, might review audio or video recordings of the sessions. But of course, if you've just spent 2 days doing usability sessions, you've got 2 days worth of video to wade through. And of course, technology can help you. You can sit in front of a piece of software that'll allow you to mark a particular instance in a recording, and that of course is extremely good. But all that I do to compensate in my typing my notes is I have a little macro that I wrote from Microsoft Word, and I hit Control T, and it sticks the current time against the note, and I can just match it up with the recording. So it works really well, and it's really, really simple, and that's what I find the most effective.
Right.
Occasionally I will have to go and get hold of the video and look at it and see, what did I mean there, or is this really as big a deal as I thought it was? And of course, you're not really looking for absolutely everything that anyone's ever done in a usability session, certainly not in the report. You're trying to spot trends, you're trying to spot things which you think might affect a lot of users, and sometimes that might be based on one user. That does happen occasionally, but most of the time you're talking about it happening, problems that occur with the majority of your participants. Almost everyone fell over when they got to this particular part of the process because they didn't understand the terminology, or the visual design was really obscure, or they needed to scroll and nobody realized that. So that's the kind of thing that mostly we're focusing on.
And do you tend to ask the users questions during the session, or do you tend to limit yourself and hold back and not intervene as much?
I do try to limit it during the actual task. So I ask them to do something, and I let them,
Mm-hmm.
by and large, proceed. If they come to a grinding halt, then I might ask them what the confusion is, or what's gone wrong for them, what's confusing them. I always try to make sure that they understand that it's not them that's having the problem; it's the site. So what is the site not doing that it could be doing to help you to achieve your goal? And then at the end of a task, if something very interesting happened that I didn't want to interrupt them about, I might go back and look at some earlier pages and just review it with them and ask them some questions. But I think it's important that they try to go through the task in as naturalistic a way as possible.
So when you're devising questions for the users, do you have any methods, techniques, or advice? I mean, how do you go about making sure that those questions are the right questions that go to the heart of what you really want to find out, and that those questions will actually unlock what you want to hear from the users?
Well, it is a question of what journey you're going to try to take them on through the site, and you of course cannot, without giving them blow by blow instructions, you can't actually completely dictate that. And I would never try to do that. I would never say, do this and then click here. Although I have sometimes tested prototypes where if they clicked anywhere but the right place, they would be fantastically confused. And under those circumstances, I have to say, well, just tell me where you'd like to click, and then we'll move on. But I try to make sure that I'm expressing the task or the goal that I want them to achieve in as natural a way as possible. So I try to disregard the terminology that's used on the site and just say, well, if I was doing this, how would I describe this? I mean, I remember working on a site where it was we were doing an evaluation of the site where people complained about the telecoms industry. It was a government department. And the idea of somebody actually moving your telephone contract between one vendor and another without your permission was given a special name by the industry. It was called slamming. And believe it or not, that's how they described it on the website. So, we set them the goal. The task that I gave users was, you've just discovered that your telephone supply has been moved from BT to Virgin. And I'm not implying that Virgin had anything to do with this, by the way. And you need to contact this department to find out what to do. Try doing that on the site. Just that's your goal, to try to find out who to tell or how to tell them. And nobody could do that task with their site because it was called slamming. And we knew that. We could have told them that up front, but their site was put together by people who knew a lot about that particular industry, but didn't appear to know very much about how other people thought about it. So it was a low empathy problem.
And so in relation to developing these questions, how concretely do you go about developing a user testing script?
Well, my scripts are not actually awfully elaborate. My script would be something like stating the goal in a naturalistic way, like the one I just described to you, setting a scenario so it all seems like it's pretty natural. You can imagine yourself being in this situation, or maybe you even know somebody who's been in that situation. So, for example, we were testing for a UK high street retailer a new method of choosing delivery or collection from a store or that kind of thing. And we wanted to see how it compared, or how users thought it compared with one of the big US sites who did something similar. So we just said, well, you were trying to buy this camera before you left the UK, because that's what we'd given them as a scenario for the UK site. You were trying, but you failed. So now you're in Los Angeles and you want to buy this SLR camera. Go to Best Buy and buy an SLR camera for delivery to a store near you. And so we just let them do it. And that was the brief, that was the script for doing that. And I simply took notes. And you do actually sometimes have to persuade people not to keep stopping and asking you for directions, which is slightly odd. You wouldn't necessarily expect that. And I'm still not quite used to it, having been doing it for 20 years. But you just have to keep saying, just do it the way that you would do it if you were sitting at home trying to do this, or sitting in your hotel in Los Angeles trying to do this. And they go through, and you ask them questions at appropriate points about why did they make that choice, or what was it about this design that persuaded them to go that route. And at the end, we asked them how they liked it, and we had some really useful feedback for the developers of this UK site. So very, very straightforward. I can show you the site if you're interested. It's Best Buy. They used to be in the UK, and in fact, the one guy we had who used to live near the Best Buy in the UK really liked the Best Buy site, but I'm afraid he was the only one. So I'm going to the Best Buy site, bestbuy.com. I'm going to pretend I'm in the United States, and I'm going to look up products. I'm going to go to cameras and camcorders. I'm going to, there we go. DSLR cameras was the goal. And one of the main things was that it was just so much in your face. A lot of users are actually commenting that, wow, compared to the UK side, I really don't know where to look because there's just so much of it. And there's Canon and Nikon and Sony down the right hand side. So it turns out it's body and lenses that we're after. And some people chose to go down the left-hand navigation, and some people went down the right-hand navigation. And none of the model numbers for Canon are the same in the UK and the US. So we just had to say, well, choose a cheap one. So we add this to our cart, and and then they get offered insurance and all kinds of other stuff, and a printer and all kinds of things. And of course, they then get confused about what to do. But it turns out there's a no thanks, go to cart down here, and we get towards the end here. I think it's there we go. So they can ship it to me. And then we discover, because we want it delivered to a store near our hotel, that somewhere on here used to be, there we go, where it says my location. I'm in zip code 00000. I can edit that, and I can type in the North Hollywood zip code that they happen to be located at. They've changed this design since we last did this. So, and I can then go, I don't want any of this other stuff. I'll go to the checkout. And then when I get to the checkout, I can do useful stuff like, I don't really check out as a guest.
Have they changed it for the better or for the worse?
Well, it's not as obvious to me how you actually collect it from a store, whereas it used to be much more obvious. And again, I'm actually finding it a little bit hard to see here. They're only offering me shipping. There we go. It's worse. It's actually worse. It's they keep going on about shipping address, shipping at this point, and it used to be only a few months ago that they were going on about you can collect this in store. So I'm just going to try enter shipping address. I don't want it shipped. I really don't want it shipped. I want to go and pick it up. It seems like they've actually stopped doing it.
So rather than improve it, they just decided to get rid of it altogether.
So it's not there now. So if this is what we'd been faced with a few months back, we wouldn't have been doing this. But it used to be really easy on the Best Buy. Okay. Inadvertently, I've chosen a camera which is only available for shipping. So actually, what I'd have to do is backtrack. But you get the idea. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm now actually faced with the only piece of information about me picking it up is that I can only ship it. So that's the kind of thing that we were doing. And as I say, it was just a question of setting the expectation, setting the goal appropriately, and then just seeing how users managed. And they managed pretty well, to be honest, in spite of the fairly overwhelming nature of the Best Buy site. But obviously that at the time we were choosing a camera that was available in store.
So most of a designer's work is carried out without the presence of the users. And so do you have any advice or any good techniques for designers to use so that they always keep the mindset and that they keep their users present in their minds as much as possible when they're designing?
Well, I'm not necessarily so good at that, to be honest. I mean, I know when designs are more complicated than they should be, but one of the things I like to use is actually a good old-fashioned keystroke level model, KLM, from Gomes, Card Moran and Newell back in the 1980s, where we just look at how complicated we're making the user interface, how many clicks, how many mouse moves, how many, etc., how many times am I going to have to stop and think about it. So I do tend to use that because it's a good rule of thumb, and it actually means you can show people and persuade them, look, if we design it this way, it's going to take the KLM approach predicts it's going to take this amount of time, and if we do it that way, the KLM predicts it's going to take that amount of time. So I find that very useful. I think because I've actually done a lot of usability testing over the years, I'm not too bad at kind of innately thinking about how confusing or otherwise this is going to be. But I always do get surprised. Some things that I think are really obvious, especially if I've been doing the design, I convince myself that this is a really cool approach. And typically, if it actually is cool, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. I know Apple likes to pride themselves on all the cool stuff it does, but if you're doing it because it's cool, you've usually got the wrong motives in play there. So just my general experience of what I've seen work and what I've seen not work, and my awareness that we need to be using terminology and concepts that people are comfortable with, which by these days for e-commerce is actually pretty well established. So we're not having to really reinvent um, ourselves or our designs for e-commerce sites so much. But novel ideas can be a completely different story, and trying to do that without real user involvement can be very risky. I would make sure to be doing user research really early on.
So with regards to the degree of intervention as a designer, do you feel that it's important for a designer to really get into the context of use and really get into the shoes of the user, or do you feel that it's perhaps a good idea to hold back and have an analytical distance to the actual context of use?
Well, quite the contrary. I think that's essential. I think it's really important if you're talking about certainly new or relatively unusual problem domains that you actually go out and you, if not lead the user research, then at least be a very involved participant or observer in it, so that you are meeting with real users, you are understanding what the problem domain is about, and you have a good grounding
Right,
in
right, good point.
what's going to work or what isn't going to work, what kind of problems actually are of interest. Because in most cases, we actually are trying to define a niche for our new product or service. Not everybody can be Amazon. In fact, Amazon is so good at being Amazon that there isn't really that much scope for being, all things to all men. So we're typically looking for niche areas. I run a 2-day workshop called Persona Driven Design, where I take research that I've done on grocery shopping and I present it to the participants in the workshop as I got it. So I've got about I can't remember whether it's 100 or 200 little cards, all with observations or things that people have said about grocery shopping, some of it online, some of it offline. And I try to get the participants in the workshop to identify what problem they see in front of them that looks like their site might like to solve. And that can be, there are about half a dozen easy ones and quite a few less obvious. But one of the easy ones is that one of the four participants one of the four users that I interviewed for the research had a food allergy. And so you could actually come up with a very sophisticated site whose main purpose in life was to actually help people with food allergies to do shopping. Because if you try doing it with any of the standard, we've got about 6 big supermarkets in the UK, and they are all now offering online shopping. And in many cases, the best you can hope for is to find out whether something is gluten-free, almost. Some things will say they're gluten-free. Some things which are gluten-free won't say that because, of course, they can't guarantee it. But it's not like a nut allergy. Gluten allergy typically is not so severe that if there was a trace of gluten, you'd suffer a reaction. So something which actually helps you with food choices, lifestyle choices, in fact, is what we ended up calling it in one place. Although somebody said that if they had an allergy, they wouldn't want to call it a lifestyle choice. But perhaps we're getting a bit too pedantic about the concept there. But making sure that we're actually meeting the needs of real users, and of course representing those needs in a way that helps us bring them to the team in a useful way, and that's where I think empathetic design and personas come in.
And what do personas typically contain?
Well, they're based on the research that you've done, this research that I've been talking about, which in fact is fairly standard approach in social sciences called grounded theory. But Karen Holtzblatt and her colleagues have written a couple of books which they call contextual design. I think her rapid contextual design is probably the more succinct of the two. It's certainly the smaller. I think it is the more succinct as well. And it's about actually understanding the real problems of real users and then deciding how those behaviors and needs actually can be addressed by your solution, and representing those behaviors and needs in a persona. So the persona itself is made up. It's a made up person with a face and a name and a little bit of a backstory, which more usually describes the motivation that they've got. Something. Julie is a busy homemaker, but also works 2 or 3 days a week in the local school, and so she's got limited time to actually go out and do shopping. So she's very keen on online shopping, but her kids have got allergies, and she needs to make sure that what she's buying, etc., etc. So that would be a persona. I actually find that using a photograph or photographs of the participants in the research works very well. You try to take them in a realistic setting, and of course you get participants' permissions for this. But talking about, say, Julie in our development within our team, instead of talking about users, is actually from a psychology point of view, a psychological point of view, very much more effective. And there are lots of studies that show that our brains are wired for feeling empathy towards individuals as opposed to empathy towards groups of people. So the persona is actually trying to build on that, is trying to make this person seem real, and of course it's also trying to make this person seem finite. And I've got that cartoon I mentioned to you, and I'll just drag that up now. My perfect user that I did years ago. Let me find it. Here we go. You can find this on the interwebby thing by typing in the perfect user, but it's actually, I call it an Ellie Camungle bat because it's an elephant, camel, monkey, eagle bat. And I got a friend of mine who used to work with my wife on the Oxford Reading Treat, Alex Brichter. He's a great cartoonist, and he drew this up for me. And it is indeed, as you can see from the image, an elephant at the front and a monkey towards the back, and it's got the visual acuity of an eagle, the memory of an elephant, the navigation skills of a bat, meaning that it can actually see in the dark, stamina of a camel, doesn't ever have to leave the computer or the tablet until the job is done, no matter how long that's going to take, and the dexterity of a monkey. It can actually do a 3-fingered salute with one hand and a double right mouse click with the other simultaneously. So when we start talking about real people, this mythical creature kind of evaporates. We now know we're talking about say Julie, and we know that she is just this lady who has these problems, and she does not have these fantastic navigation skills, and we actually deliberately get quite specific about her abilities and what she's familiar with typically, and that's the persona. So the face and the name is made up, the backstory is made up. It is actually meant to be an empathetic way of explaining and presenting our user community or communities to the team, and for them to work with that. And of course, I think we need to do these collaboratively. I think dumping personas on teams is not the thing that we should be doing. We should be trying to cross-educate each other, the technologists educating the UX people and the UX people educating the technologists.
And can you show us a particular persona example that you've used previously?
I have to say that I've talked and written a lot more about personas than I've actually used them. But my one story in this area is that years ago, when I was the first hire for a new company that was spawned out of Oxford Metrics. In fact, the Oxford Metrics group, who have been around since 1980s, and they're the manufacturers of Vicon, which is quite big in the motion picture industry now. It was originally just for medical use, believe it or not. But I was working on some of the early Vicon systems back in the late 1980s, early 90s. I just came across a an old archive folder. I was trying to open up some documents, and Word was telling me that these documents were too old to open. But I persuaded it in the end, and some of them are dated 1988. So that's how long ago this was. But around about 2000, they were going to. It was a joint venture between OMG, Oxford Medical Group, and Oxford University, and I was the first hire because I was already known to OMG, and I was the only person on the team who wasn't a computer vision scientist. And number one in our list of goals for this product was that it should be easy to use. And regrettably, I quickly discovered that if you take a bunch of computer vision scientists and talk to them about ease of use, they are very much inclined to talk about ease of use from the point of view of a computer vision scientist, which is nothing like the kind of ease of use that we were looking for. So I spent the next 2 and a bit years almost as a professional wet blanket saying, no, we can't do that. It won't be usable. That's too complicated, etc., etc. But happily, in the first few months, I was actually able to persuade the team, as we were, to find a real potential user and go and talk to him or her. And that happened. And we spent only a day doing this. But this particular potential user, and I'm just going to call her Jane because that's how I refer to the persona, freely admitted that she was not a computer vision scientist, that she really didn't get some of the 3D graphics stuff that we were going to be working with, but she was very comfortable with 2D graphics that she had quite a long background in. And this was actually pretty typical for the kind of user that we were targeting. So from that point forward, because the whole team had met her, I spent a long time with her in the morning, and then the rest of the team turned up and they were talking to her and chatting, and they all got to meet her. They all got to understand that she was not a computer vision scientist, and we never did formally produce a persona because really we didn't need to. Jane became our persona just outright. We only had one user that we were allowed to interview, or we had time to interview. So Jane did it, and it was very productive to be able to refer to Jane and Jane's admitted limitations in this area, and it just really saved the project. And we went on to win an Emmy Award for this product called Boujou, Boujou, and I think we might be looking a little bit at it later on.
Are there any potential pitfalls or things that we should be careful of or mindful of when developing personas?
Well, I think the biggest pitfall is the way that we tend to do it these days, and it's doing no one any favors. We often go off and do the user research or have someone else do the user research in isolation, away from the team, away from, in some cases, even away from the company. I have friends and colleagues who do things like developing personas as a business, and I'm afraid I think that is the wrong thing to be doing. I think the development team needs to be involved. The developers, those that are interested and willing, ought to be involved as observers. The team themselves ought to be choosing the names and writing the backstories and so forth. So it really ought to be a collaborative effort. So by the time we've developed these personas, we've actually all met real users. We've all understood something about their needs and behaviors. And for example, what fits in nicely with that is this grounded theory approach that I mentioned. That if you go out and do what is talked about in contextual design, you go out and interview 10 or 12 users, you come back with 1,000 or more observations, affinity notes, Karen Holtzblatt calls them, and each of those is written in the first person. So something like, when I go shopping, I use the order of the products in the aisle as a reminder, and we put that on the table with the other 999 cards, and we have a big workshop, and everybody who is interested or involved in the project, which may be up to 12 people, and that's typically the kind of size that Holtzblatt talks about, Karen talks about for this kind of activity called an affinity diagramming workshop. Everybody there actually is reading the whole day these things written in the first person that have come directly from the people that we did our research with. So it's a fantastically good way of just making sure that everybody is understanding the kinds of things, that the kinds of problems, the kinds of issues, the kinds of solutions that would be appropriate for these users.
So, and moving towards the end, now you've worked both as a user experience specialist, you've worked as a writer, a software engineer, and you've done so many things in your career. What would you describe as your greatest achievement?
Well, there are a couple of contenders. I'm really very proud or pleased to be able to say that Buju won an Emmy, which I didn't even know was possible. So, that tends to go pretty high up in my CV. But really, it's kind of what happened post Buju. Buju got me wondering, well, these guys really, the developers I was working with, really just can't see how difficult these systems are from the average user's perspective. So I got interested enough in this to start doing some research, and I actually did a postgraduate course in social research. I think I've actually got a postgraduate diploma in psychological research methods, if I remember correctly, in order so that I could do this. And this research is all about empathizing, systemizing theory. And I'll find you a couple of slides to show you. I think they're actually at the beginning of this show. So let me here we go. So this original model comes out of the Autism Research Center and work that Simon Baron-Cohen does, and he and his colleagues have identified these two characteristics, one called empathy, and empathizers are people who are really interested in other people and are really good at something he refers to as theory of mind, which isn't quite as strange as it sounds, or even mind reading, which sounds even stranger. But all of that is just about how we can understand what other people are thinking, so that we actually literally can carry in our heads a kind of a state representation of the person that we're talking to. And we're aware of that, and we're really good at it. And people who are really good at empathy can read all kinds of clues from the person they're talking to about whether they're really being sincere, or whether they're really as interested as they're making out, that kind of thing. So there's empathy, and then there's systemizing. And systemizers are really interested in how things work and causality, and tend to get really excited about stuff like Stonehenge, which is not too far down the road from me here. It's near Salisbury, and I'm in Oxford. But systemizers don't necessarily have any empathizing skills, and vice versa. By the way, in the general population, they have what Baron-Cohen refers to as a balanced brain. So, they're perhaps equally good or equally bad at systemizing and empathizing. But I went out and did this research with 440 actually people in the IT field. So it was a self-completion questionnaire. I got people to do the systemizing and empathizing questionnaires, which you can find on the internet, by the way. And I also got them to tell me where in IT did they work, at the people end or at the technology end, or if they spent half their time doing each, then somewhere in the middle. But the thing I was actually quite interested in is this reaction that we still see from software teams, individual developers, perhaps the old RTFM effect, which I will loosely translate into read the friendly manual. But if you look it up, yeah, that's right. If you look it up on Wikipedia, you'll get the unexpurgated version. It is on Wikipedia, and I actually wore this on my T-shirt in big letters when I was giving my paper at the Chi conference in 2009. This is a pretty standard reaction from somebody who has done what they thought was best, given all the circumstances, but actually perhaps was never given access to users, or really didn't have the ability to understand what this problem looks like from an outside user's perspective. So their reaction naturally is, well, I've done it right. The program works. What's the problem? Read the friendly manual. And it turns out that if you take these empathizing and systemizing scores, and I've done it separately for men and women for reasons that will become apparent, those men who worked at the people end of technology so these would be technical writers and usability and maybe user experience people, had very much higher than average empathy scores, and also noticeably higher than average systemizing scores, bearing in mind that all of these people worked in IT. So the average, by the way, for systemizing in the general population is this thin green line at about 31, so that's called SQ control, and the average in the male population for empathizing is about 38, that's that thin blue line. And you can see that both of these start out higher than average, which is not surprising because they're working in IT. They must have some systemizing skills to do that, and that line rises, the systemizing line rises as we get closer to the technology end. The empathizing quotient, though, does odd things. It starts off very high because these people are working with people in technology, so if they're technical writers or usability specialists, they're actually pretty good at empathizing, at understanding a problem from someone else's point of view. And that's all going along swimmingly until about the middle, at which point this is a severe downhill slope. And what we found now is that SQ is very much higher than EQ. EQ is jumped noticeably below the average for the population. And what we actually have here is a kind of a mathematical demonstration of nerdiness. This is what nerdiness is about, this kind of fascination with detail, which is almost essential in some aspects of IT, but really not much ability to see a problem from another person's perspective, or certainly diminished abilities in that area. And in fact, there was a very small study at the University of Southampton that said SQ minus EQ was actually the best predictor of programming ability at the time. But it was a tiny study, about 18 men. But there's other anecdotal evidence that this is kind of the combination you want for really detailed technical design. That's really not my issue here. My issue is that the EQ is is very low, and so trying to do everything we can, that is really what this idea of empathetic design I mentioned is about, to bring users, or the problems that users have, or the understanding of the problem users have, into the team. That's because the team may well have this issue with low empathy. Now, I also did this for women, but women don't have the SQ minus EQ issue, that the SQ is always lower than the EQ for women. There were only about 10 women, by the way, in the whole study, and there were about 200 something women in the study that said that they were purely technology oriented. So we have this hiccup at the end of the graph, but I have no good explanation for it, and I didn't interview these people. I have no idea why this is happening, and it doesn't really affect the overall outcome, which is that certainly for men, we may be working, especially if we're talking about people working in technologically very demanding situations, we may be talking about people who really find it very hard to understand that other people aren't as good with technology. Other people see the problem differently. And so that's a serious issue. And I was able to present this to both the CHI conference in 2009. I also had it accepted to the British HCI Group conference in 2009. I actually pointed out to the second conference that it had already been accepted to the first conference, but that seemed to have got lost in translation somewhere. So they actually had it peer reviewed and accepted again. So there's one paper that got accepted twice. But this is actually a chart from one of the Autism Research Center studies, or certainly Simon Baron Cohen studies, that shows a distribution of men, women, and Asperger's syndrome. People diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And really for my study, the people at the technology end, the men at the technology end, are kind of in this systemizing, and some of them are in this extreme systemizing, so the S and the extreme S. And it does mean that the empathy scores are pretty low. And the converse happens up at the other end. We've got a lot of women in extreme empathy, and there's one man kind of right on the border. but there are no men actually in the extreme empathy. So it is an interesting area. I'm really pleased that the study worked out, and as I say, I actually did part of a degree in order to be able to do it. So I'm pretty pleased with the outcome. And what I'm really happiest about is that it actually does show that we really need to work on trying to make users seem real to our development teams, because there is this kind of mythical belief that we can specify a user experience and the user interface that goes with it in its entirety at the beginning of a project and just let the development team implement it without really thinking about it. And I think that's just misplaced entirely, that there are hundreds if not thousands of decisions that will have to be made. There are lots of things that can't be implemented the way that they were specified, all kinds of things. Schedules will change, features will get left out, features will be added. We need to actually have the user experience people in there making users seem real and working alongside the development team. And I think empathetic design and this other approach that I refer to as persuasive facilitation, where we realize that we're actually going to have to do a sales job as far as making user experience important to the team. I mean, some teams will more naturally than others have higher UX maturity, but a low UX maturity team really is going to have to be sold the idea of user experience, and part of the role of the UX specialist on a team is to do that sales job as well.
So would you say that the low EQ problem is something that's inherent in our discipline, or would you say that it's something that can be overcome by limiting or working on the detachment between the user and the designer?
Well, I certainly think it can be overcome. I think this is just a tendency that people who are in this S and extreme S part of the graph will have a tendency towards low empathy, but I think that can be overcome through a number of means. I mean, Baron Cohen even has a product, a DVD called Mind Reading, which stars Daniel Radcliffe as about a 9-year-old, the Harry Potter guy. As a 9-year-old. If you're interested, you can look it up. It's called Mind Reading by Baron Cohen. He won an award for it, and it teaches empathy. And he actually has expressions of all kinds of emotions in there, 90% of which I do not understand, to be honest. I do some of Baron Cohen's tests. He's got a battery. He's got a series of 36 photos of just the eyes of people. And for each one of those photos, he's got 4 emotions that you're supposed to choose from one of them. And I got 31 out of 35 wrong. And my daughter got 34 out of 35 right. So I think I have a natural tendency towards low empathy. But I've overcome it, and I think it is possible if you're aware of it. And I think the analogy I like to make is with, dyslexia. If somebody's dyslexic, we don't just say, well, don't read then. Reading is an important skill. We should really be trying to help these people overcome dyslexia. And my daughter is slightly dyslexic, and my wife had to spend many hours with her, coaching her with very specific approaches to dealing with some of the problems with dyslexia, and she's doing very well now. In fact, she's a copywriter, which is pretty amazing given where she started. But I think we can do the same with empathy. I think that once people start to realize that these are real human beings we're talking about, and not this vague collective noun called users, and they actually start to see what real people look like, and perhaps even learn how to interact with real people a little bit. I'm aware that people who are at the extreme end of the autism spectrum find interacting with people painfully difficult or embarrassing, and so they don't want to do it. And I'm not saying you should drag your backroom technologists out into the field kicking and screaming. But for people who are interested in user experience, and quite a few technologists are, it's something that we can work on and we can overcome. But we're really not doing that. I've just started teaching a course for a UK university in traditional object-oriented software engineering, and I did a master's degree in this subject about 20 years ago. And I have to tell you, the course could have been written 20 years ago. It's not very much changed. It makes a slightly bigger nod towards users than the course I did in the 1990s. But it still talks about users as if you can go out and ask them what they want and implement it. And we know that that just doesn't work. The analogy I use is that it's like asking a 7-year-old what their favorite dinner would be. You know, by the time you've made it, they may not be interested in it anymore. They may not actually understand why you did it this way. They don't know. Users know nothing about the business requirements. They may know very little about what's possible. They might know almost nothing about what you're planning to change or how the system is going to be different. So just going and asking them, treating them just like any other shareholder, sorry, I should say stakeholder, is absolute craziness. But that's how software engineering is still approaching the problem. So it's a big problem.
And that leads into my final question, and that is, a lot of your recent work has been in agile UX. And so what do you feel is the current standing of that field?
Well, it's very encouraging to see that some of the really big companies like Microsoft and Autodesk and quite a few others are embracing agile user experience, in the sense that they're moving away from, or have moved away from, this mistaken belief that you can do all your user experience design up front. So they are working much more closely in an approach that was, I think, pretty much pioneered at Autodesk, which you might call parallel streams, where the UX stream is working 1 or 2 cycles ahead of the development stream to elaborate the user stories, to do visual designs just in time, so that every time they're working on something, it's with the current thinking about this solution, not with something that was thought of 6, 9, 12 months ago. And my hope is that that will actually be taken up more broadly. But we've been at that now for probably around about 10 years as I speak, and we're probably going to be at it for the next 10 or 20. It still seems to be completely unheard of in smaller companies. A lot of the courses I teach are to participants from smaller organizations, and the standard approach in software engineering is very much the one that I described. If you go off and do a degree in software engineering, you're not going to learn necessarily very much about users and how to involve them in the development process at all, except as one flavor of stakeholders. So I have hopes, but I'm not overly optimistic. But having said that, I was really heartened to discover that Isaac Newton spent 50 years trying to persuade people that light really did behave the way that he described. And, you know, it's something so obvious as light splitting into an array of colors through a prism is that hard to persuade, then I think we could probably afford to let agile UX have a little bit longer. But my real hope is that, given where we are now with the technology, that it's really everywhere, and a very wide array of people are using it on a daily basis. My hope is that this would have inspired us into working out where some of the fundamental problems are in our development processes. But that is only happening in a fairly limited way, unfortunately, as we speak.
Right. So that was the final question for you, William. And thanks again so much for taking the time to speak with us and to share your experiences with our audience. And it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks again.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.